Hey everybody, just want to pick up on our video looking at the three sociological perspectives. Now, when looking at the structural functionalist perspective, functionalists are going to talk about the various functions that institutions serve. And within these four, the first one they're going to talk about are manifest functions. And that's the idea that a manifest function is something that an institution explicitly states they're trying to achieve. Now, the example I give here is universities. This idea of universities explicitly state that they are trying to train their students to be productive employees, thoughtful citizens. These are things that if an institution achieves it, it's its manifest function because that's the objective it sought to achieve, and it did. Being a criminologist, I'll use some criminology examples here as well. Now, looking at prisons, the idea of, the manifest function of prisons, and I've got different feelings about this, are that they are meant to make the public safer and also punish somebody for wrongdoing. So if that happens, that is the manifest function of prison. That's the idea that prisons are achieving the goals that they established to achieve. Now, with institutions, there's also latent functions, and these are things that occur within that institution. However, they either go unnoticed or would appear unrelated to the actual goals and objective of that institution. And so revisiting the prison examples, the idea of prisons tend to be what we call schools of crime. And that's for various reasons. Like, for example, we look a lot at the high recidivism rates in the U.S. That's the high rate of individuals that are incarcerated that end up getting rearrested and reincarcerated later on, and that's due to a lot of structural flaws within our incarceration and reentry system. However, the idea that prisons are actually leading to a rise in crime because of high recidivism rates, that would be a latent function, because clearly that does not align with its intention, with its stated objective. However, it is occurring as a result of how that prison system is structured in this country. Now, to follow up on the university example, and that's the example I give in your reading notes, universities can produce deviance. And the reason that is, and it's pretty obvious probably to you all, is universities bring a lot of young people together with newfound freedoms. And those newfound freedoms can lead to encouragement of various types of deviance, from more mild to severe deviance. But just think of something as simple as drinking underage. That is a form of deviance that is more likely to occur within a university because universities are bringing all these young people together with these newfound freedoms. Now, that is not going to show up in the mission statement of any universities. However, it does occur. So it is a latent function of universities. Now, within these manifest and latent functions, they can be positive or negative. For example, some things that are latent, which is unintended, can actually be positive for society. On the other hand, the examples we just gave are negative. So for example, if the latent function of prisons are that it's actually increasing the crime rate because it's leading to higher rates of recidivism, then that is a negative latent function. Now, to look on the other hand, thinking about, well, what would a positive function what would that look like? Now, clearly with our aforementioned manifest function of universities trying to train you all to be thoughtful citizens, we would largely define that as a positive manifest function. But the way to think through that is, as you're coming up with your own examples and trying to learn this, think about how manifest and latent functions can be positive or negative. It's not mutually exclusive in terms of manifest are all positive and latent are all negative. That's not how this works. And you can practice that by trying to go through an institution and see, can I see what its manifest functions are, its latent functions, and would I define those as positive or negative? Now, let's wrap up with the last sociological perspective that we're going to cover of the big three, and it's conflict perspective. And as I mentioned in the last video, a lot of what conflict perspective, a lot of how they're going to approach social issues does feel at odds with the structural functionalist perspective. In fact, the biggest weakness of structural functionalism was the reality that it did not do a good job of interrogating power dynamics, power differentials, inequities, inequalities embedded in our larger structures and systems. And that's where conflict perspectives or the conflict theorists are going to jump in. That's going to be the primary focus of conflict theorists. So a conflict theorist is starting with the assumption that there are all these different groups that exist in society, and these groups have different interests that don't always align. However, so they have these different interests, and they're constantly vying to try to actually see their interests come to fruition, but also gain power over others. And a conflict theorist is going to look at that a lot. They're looking at the conflict between these groups with antagonistic interests. And so the way they look at society isn't like a functionalist. A functionalist looks at a society that's constantly in search of stasis, of stability, of social cohesion, whereas a conflict theorist is going to argue actually society is full of conflict, and the institutions in society look to promote the interests of those in power. And it's this idea that anytime there is also social change, that's a result of effort of groups that have differing interests of those in power trying to gain power and actually see some of their interests come actually to fruition. And so this is the struggle that conflict theorists are going to talk about a lot. And something we're going to talk about in conflict theory frequently throughout the semester is the way they look at how our systems and structures are set up in the US. And we can see that very much in our education systems. A structural functionalist is going to look at education and see it as the social institution that is training citizens to go and be productive parts of our economy, to be thoughtful citizens as well. A conflict theorist is going to look at education and going to look how some individuals have access to more resources than others. And this idea that education isn't some nice blank slate, because we often, especially in the US, we talk a lot about, well, just work hard. As long as you work hard and do well, you'll get opportunities. You will be rewarded for that hard work. A conflict theorist is going to say, yes, you will be rewarded for your hard work. However, some individuals are going to have much easier access to getting those rewards for their hard work, while others are going to have constant barriers in that way. For example, if you went to a school that was well funded and had lots of resources, like, for example, counselors. So if you had school counselors that were constantly working with you to try to help you prepare for college, get your applications together, apply for financial aid, all that kind of stuff maybe was just embedded in your school system. Not every school system has resources or even, the history of trying to do all that it can to help its students get into college. Often this is a result of having less funding, and funding is tied directly to property tax rates, sorry. And we're going to actually dig into that more later on in the semester and actually look at the inevitable connection between property tax rates, property value, funding of a school system, and how these things become this loop that feeds into the other. So there's individuals that grow up in families that are in neighborhoods that are in homes that are worth a lot, are going to get more resources in their school systems, and those children are going to have more access to opportunities than those students in worse off school systems. Now, a conflict theorist is going to say this is a classic example of our social institution of education being designed in a way that it's going to promote the interest of those that already come from privilege and wealth. Whereas those individuals that do not come from privilege, do not have family wealth, were not born into a home that's going to send you to a school system that has all the resources you need to succeed, that there are going to be all these barriers, that even if you're the hardest worker in that school, it's going to be much, much, much more difficult for your hard work to translate into later life success. And a conflict theorist thinks that's very intentional. And that is actually how society has been structured. So just to wrap up this section, I want you to begin to practice in the class blog and see how would a structural functionalist and a conflict theorist look at the same issue and analyze it in different ways. And so you're going to pick two different professions that have very different incomes, and you pick any two you want. And I just want you to go through as being the structural functionalist. How would you, if you're a functionalist, explain this discrepancy in income? And then part two, now be a conflict theorist. How would you describe this discrepancy in income? And then try to understand why they're describing the same issue in different ways. Just post that on the weekly blog activity, and then we can jump into section 3 of the course.